Hi, Graham.
Hey, Chris.
So we're doing this Blogging Heads today, Science Saturday, because it's the year of science, 2009, and a lot of the anniversaries that people are talking about are historic anniversaries, things that happened in the past of science. Galileo not inventing the telescope, but improving on initial design to make it more powerful than ever before, and then seeing the craters of the moon and the satellites of Jupiter. Darwin having his 200th anniversary of his birth and 150-year anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species, and also the 50-year anniversary of C.P. Snow's famous lecture, The Two Cultures, where we're both going to be at a conference in New York City talking about what this 1959 lecture means 50 years later. So I thought it would be great to talk to you, a historian of science, about what some of these moments mean. And as we reflect upon these milestones, what does a historical approach to science give us that we're not necessarily getting otherwise or from the media? So that's the discussion that I hope we'll have. And I guess to start, maybe you could tell us a little bit, since you're going to be heading up the historical panel of this C.P. Snow Two Cultures conference, a little bit about Snow and who he was and why we still talk about him.
Yeah, well, Chris, you're being very generous, but we all know that you know as much about C.P. Snow right now as just about anybody because of this book that you have just been finishing up that deals with some of this stuff. But the core question is how is it that Snow's formulation offered in the Reed Lecture at Cambridge University in 1959, his diagnosis of a chasm in intellectual life in the middle of the 20th century, i.e. two cultures, how is it that that diagnosis becomes such a touchstone for so many commentators on education, on the relationship between science and society? It's very, very rare that somebody steps to the microphone and gives a 45-minute speech and leaves the world with a coinage that just will not go away. And yet that was definitely the case with C.P. Snow's Reed Lecture 50 years ago this May.
What do you think some of the reasons are? I mean, as I understand it, part of it is he coined a great catchphrase. He really was a marketer of a concept as much as he was making a really incisive argument. But also it was the polemical battle afterwards with F.R. Leavis, the literary critic, that sort of drew added attention to the idea.
Yeah, well, maybe, the best thing for people who are interested in this subject but maybe will not have had a chance to go back and reread the published version of the Snow lecture, the best thing for us to do, Chris, might be to kind of rehash what Snow's argument was, and that'll at least get the sort of shape of his diagnosis on the table. And then we can talk a little bit about how people responded to it back in the late 50s and early 1960s. And that contextual conversation will let us, I think, get at how it was that this became such an extraordinarily powerful touchstone for so many people. So do you want to dive in? I mean, do you want to try to sketch a little bit of what the original argument was?
Yeah, and then we'll try to say, what does it look 50 years later? Right, the original argument, I actually have reread it recently because we're chattering about it on my blog. It's an interesting experiment to blog the Two Cultures lecture and see how people respond. But Snow comes to the podium and he says, I'm a guy with this unique intellectual identity because I was trained as a physicist. He was at Cambridge studying with Ernest Rutherford part of the time. I turned into a novelist, and by the time he gave this speech, he was pretty celebrated. We don't really read his novels anymore, but he was fairly celebrated as a novelist. And he'd also had done basically what we would call government science advising, including during World War II, when knowing about physics made a big difference in terms of military decisions. So he comes up and he says, I've noticed something basically in hanging out in intellectual life with two different groups of people is that they really don't understand each other. And on the one hand, he says, I've been hanging out with essentially physicists, and on the other hand, I've been hanging out with literary intellectuals. And boy, they don't know how to have a conversation. They don't have a lot of respect for each other. At this point, the conversation turned kind of more negative toward the literary people and more positive toward the scientists. And then you realize what Snow was really up to was saying that, my God, we really need to understand the scientists because they have the power to change the world.
Yeah, and it's the power to change the world part of his lecture that's, I think, often forgotten when people just use the catchphrase that he gave us. So his diagnosis that there are two cultures in the modern university, in modern intellectual life, and then more ominously in modern public life, is pretty tight. And that's the part that has been retained, that diagnosis of this split. But people often forget the last half of the lecture and the published essay, which points to the question of the developing world, the South globally, and their urgent demands for increased medical care, better access to high-quality nutrition. And he really begins to point to the global challenges that are being faced in particular ways by the poor, and says it's the men of science, and it was very much the men for him. It's the men of science who are going to be in a position to address this mounting catastrophe of poverty and malnutrition and overpopulation. And it's not clear that the men of arts and letters have really grasped this pending global calamity, and B, it's not clear that their high-handed and condescending attitude toward technology and science is really authorized in view of the fact that they have very little to offer on this pending, urgent global need. So that is where he starts throwing the kind of moral weight of the lecture around a good deal. And it's that part that inflamed some sensibilities, to be sure, among the leading critics and literary figures, especially in the UK, but also in New York and globally in the years that went forward.
Yeah. And that's what we often forget is everyone pictures, Snow saying, and he does say, on the one hand, the literary people don't understand the second law of thermodynamics, the scientists haven't read enough Shakespeare. We remember that. We don't remember this interesting prescription of basically how to save the world through progressive egalitarian technoscience, which obviously didn't happen. And so you forget that Snow even said he wanted his lecture. He wished he'd retitled it "The Rich and the Poor."
Yeah, I mean, it's worth nudging, two things. On the one hand, you strongly emphasized his roots in physics, which does ever so slightly nudge upwards his cultural cum techno-scientific authority. He was basically a chemist. That was his practicing scientific work. And he was involved from a research perspective in work that bears on nutritional questions. In the end, a lot of his work in that area was superseded relatively quickly, but he was working on the identification and loosely on the synthesis of some of the chemical compounds that were being identified as crucial vitamins in the period.
I didn't realize that, yeah.
Yeah, it's also very important to note that, and I don't mean this invidiously, his scientific career was short-lived and not especially illustrious. So he is an early example of someone who parlays a relatively modest scientific career into very considerable cultural and political authority over the course of his career. Much of the interest in his novels proceeded from his claim to be representing an aspect of modern life that very few novelists had been able to take on, laboratory life, the life among scientists. And much of his cultural authority socially in the halls of power in London proceeded from his claim to having techno-scientific expertise. So I don't mean to suggest that there's bad faith in his diagnosis, because I do think that there's, it's an earnest effort on his part to get at something that concerned him about the direction of specifically English higher education at mid-century. And I think he was also talking about a genuine geopolitical crisis that he saw in the offing, a crisis not entirely delinked from the Cold War, and there's more to say there. But what is essential to bear in mind is that there is something of a fib in the diagnosis, insofar as he is himself, by 1959, a striking example of just how far you can take scientific authority outside of the traditional domains of science.
Absolutely.
His literary career and his political career are largely the product of his preceding, and as I say, not especially distinguished scientific career. So in that sense, there's something a little weird going on. And in many ways, the very, very serious cultural authority of science by 1959 or 60 is being veiled slightly by his lamentations for how the high table literary dons of England disregard the sciences.
Oh, totally right. I mean, this is, and this is, we can talk about why the lecture now had such an impact, and then, how we would interpret it 50 years later. This is 2 years after Sputnik. The United States is about to invest a fortune in developing its scientific infrastructure, and I guess something similar on perhaps a smaller scale happened in the UK. So, governments are turning to science, not that they hadn't before, but they're turning to it in a very, very big way. And here's Snow saying governments don't listen to science. But maybe that's why, he was saying it at the right moment.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that anxiety about the quality and extent of education in science and engineering was at a fever pitch by the late 1950s in the West. And so you're absolutely right that he's hitting a sore spot with this diagnosis, insofar as people have come broadly to accept that science and technology are going to be critical going forward. The other thing I just wanted to tweak slightly is, you said before that it didn't really work out quite like Snow had said, and it's, in some sense, it didn't, but in other ways, it did. I mean, the Green Revolution, which marked a remarkable transformation in agricultural productivity on a global scale, and which was largely the means by which some of the doomsday scenarios concerning overpopulation and famine and malnutrition and so forth were avoided. It's the case that was largely the product of increasingly sophisticated agroengineering. And while we now have a host of very important critiques, environmental, economic, of the damage that was done across the Green Revolution, I think it's very hard to work out what the counterfactual would have been. We have very little sense of what would have happened if the population rates had continued to increase as they did in the post-war period, but there had not been a corresponding rapid and multifold increase in the world's food-producing power. So in that sense, Snow's cry for what was needed wasn't entirely off base, and the next decade or so bore him out to a considerable degree. I mean, you'll recall the phrase he uses, I think now in many ways notorious, for what the world wanted, right? He says the world needs jam. And by jam, he means in a slightly self-satisfied bourgeois English way, the goods of life. Yeah. And there's no question that the world got a lot more jam from 1960 to 1980, and now one of the major scientific problems that scientists in a host of different domains deal with is how to unjam us from the jam that all that jam got us in. Yeah.
Right. No, totally. But the phrase "jam for the poor." There's a couple, catchphrases from the lecture. One is "Science will provide jam for the poor." The other, "The scientists have the future in their bones," and the literary intellectuals act as if the future didn't exist. These are the kind of things that got him into trouble. Well, let me try to be presentist since I'm the journalist here and yank us out of 1960, 1959, and say, well, if you look at this today, why do we still talk about him? given that some people would say it was an oversimplifying analysis, and yet it still, in some way resonates, and so people talk about two cultures of science versus politics, two cultures of science versus journalists, two cultures of scientists versus literary intellectuals. It's a dichotomy that can be multiplied, and applied to almost anything. And maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, but I mean, Chris, like once you start multiplying dichotomies, they're not dichotomies anymore, and that's part of what always seems kind of offhand about the whole thing. I mean, why it retains currency is in some ways a story I feel like you can probably tell better than I, given that I think the answer lies in a sketch of the channels by which popular scientific communication has occurred over the last 50 years. So, I think it's more than anything else a journalistic catchphrase, and it is as a journalistic catchphrase rather than a substantive diagnosis of either the kind of modern collective condition in some kind of metaphysical sense, or indeed even, to put it in a more minor key, as a diagnosis of simply the institutions of higher education in the developed West. It's really as a catchphrase journalistically that it hangs on, rather than as either of the latter. So, its relevance now, not to be puckish, but, my sense is its relevance now is that it constitutes an occasion for people to return to a set of important topics, like what do you want the role of science and technology to be in your polity? And anything that gives people an excuse for taking that question up in a serious way and discussing it, I think we have to applaud. And Snow's formulation has kind of canalized one whole line of conversations on that topic. The way in which it's canalized them, I think we have to lament. The ways in which it causes that topic to return and return and return, I think that we have to applaud, because that is a very serious question that I think anybody who cares either about politics or about science or wants to have people engaging. Just to cut quickly to the chase, some of the major flaws in the formulation that made it, in many respects, irrelevant then and even more irrelevant now as a diagnosis, I think you'd have to point first to the way in which the formulation entirely overlooks the social sciences. So, how it is that Snow could have diagnosed the problem in the modern university and, at his most extravagant, diagnosed the problem in civilization at large as a radical dichotomous, educational life, and split that between the sciences, by which he means, as you say, something like physics and chemistry, on the one hand, and literature, novel writing, and sort of the arts or something on the other. How he could do that without taking seriously the social sciences, it's just deranged. By the late 1950s, early 1960s, you have practically 200 years of people applying in serious ways the techniques and the findings of the sciences to the study of human social groups, study of the human individual, study of the dynamics of humans and groups, whether those be economic dynamics or cultural or socio-political dynamics. And in effect, there's a whole line of the study of politics, which really is nothing more than a contention that politics itself needs to be treated as a science.
Yeah.
And so, Snow's back-of-the-envelope treatment of the topic leaves no room for any serious engagement with that field, which even by the mid-1950s had already become a major point of investment for governments that were increasingly concerned with increasing their stature globally. Again, we're back to the Cold War issue. Social Science Research Council. People are investing in a very serious way in these forms of knowledge, and they don't fit at all into Snow's formulation.
Yeah. Just to push back a little, though, I definitely think he elides the social sciences. He says in the lecture, I realize that the number 2 is a dangerous number, but I was going for something between complete rhetoric and completely accurate topography of academic life, and I'm happy with the necessary oversimplification. But I think that even that when he leaves out social science, and he clearly does. Nevertheless, I think one reason we still talk about it is also just this idea that people get too specialized, which I think is probably always going to be right in some way. In other words, if you apply yourself to one discipline, as many people do, and many other people apply themselves to some other discipline, and they learn the jargon, they learn the norms that go with being an expert in this area, and then they try to talk to each other. It doesn't work as well, perhaps, as it might have if neither of them had spent those 10 years in that discipline. So I think that he's getting at that too. And I think that people, when they think it's still relevant, they're thinking along those lines a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, but you've got diagnoses of specialization that go back an awful long way. So, yeah. I mean, I'll grant you that that's an element of his diagnosis, but it's a particularly polemical way to structure that diagnosis if that was really what he intended. Because in many respects, the codification of, professionalized academic disciplines across the 19th century is to be applauded, and I think most people would think of it as, something like a manifestation of what you want to call, progress in the history of learning. Specialization does raise the question of what the common culture is, and to the extent that political decisions, particularly in Democratic come Republican political organization, are required to be decisions emergent from something like collectives. That question of what the common culture is becomes a very sharp question. But I have to say that you already have a relatively healthy contrary tradition that really takes politics not to be especially democratic or Republican, but to be technocratic and autocratic as it is technocratic. And those kinds of political approaches had been enormously sympathetic to the sciences and had made a gambit for world dominance between 1917 and 1945, with consequences that remain with us in many respects today. So you might interpret Snow as suggesting, and I've never really thought of it this way, but there's something to it. You might think of him as responding to the challenge of Soviet top-down, technocratic, and technology-friendly governance by saying something like, we in the liberal democratic West had better get up on top of these technologies using the means that are available to liberal democratic societies if we wish to remain competitive, in a sense, in the global sphere with the other side. And that's yet another way in which you can see his formulation as sort of right in the heartland of the Cold War problematic. And there's probably something to that. But I think, it waters down the fisticuffs of his argument considerably to try to make it be, more or less just a lament for disciplinary specialization in modernity.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think that the particular way in which he said it is a lot of the explanation for why it still resonated, because he said it in a strong polemical way, and that's really just one of the themes that's buried in it. Well, I want to move on. I'm here at Princeton, sort of as a journalist, taking history of science with you, and the Snow conversation lets us talk about one of the ways in which the history of science can help us think about the present and think about some of the issues that science is creating every day. So I'd love to steer us a little bit in that direction. I mean, maybe the first point is just that, as I've heard you point out, your field of study in some ways is inspired by C.P. Snow's lecture. Is that right, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I love it, Chris, when you toss me a nice softball. I mean, nothing makes me happier than an opportunity to promote the history of science, which is the field to which I've given, at this point, pretty much half my life. And I genuinely believe it's a field that is, essential for good thinking about the kind of questions that you engage in, in a contemporary and journalistic way. So, what is the history of science? On the one hand, the field is born to do the work of explaining why it is that the West is the best. So its origins lie in a rather unseemly project of trumpeting the accomplishments of Western Europe. It was about forging the kind of exceptionalist narrative of European hegemony, and doing so in a way that would climb on top of the traditional means of articulating that superiority, which was by pointing to our Judeo-Christian metaphysical theological rightness. So, sometime up through the 17th century, Europeans encountering non-European peoples had a tendency to reach for Christianity as their means of explaining their own superiority. Yeah. Over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, that becomes an increasingly untenable means by which to articulate Western European superiority, and science and technology become important new tools for demonstrating that superiority. And the history of science becomes the sort of narrative reconstruction of that rise to authorize superiority. However, it is also the case that the actual field of history of science as a modern disciplinary activity takes an enormous boost from the enthusiasm that surrounds the Snow Lecture. And there are a number of practitioners in history of science who say, but this is us. Yes, we lie, if you like, at the crotch of this chasm that you've identified. We are, as Michel Serres puts it, the tiers instruits, the thrice instructed, the people who do both the sciences and the literary humanistic activities, and therefore are capable of generating a third kind of knowledge, which is contingent on the mastery of both of those others. Mm-hmm. So, what is the history of science? The history of science, basically, that set of historical investigations that aim to explain how it is that certain people rise to the enviable position of being able to speak for the really real about the natural world and be believed and get other people to believe them. And there are a set of practices, technologies, rhetorical and social technologies, as well as kind of lab bench technologies that make that possible. And that story of who gets to speak for what's real about the natural world is very much a story about politics. It's a story about culture. Nature has been mobilized in debates about who we are and what we ought to do since forever. And what has changed is the means by which people can cement their mastery over nature and its ways. So, you've seen me do a little bit of this kind of material over the course of the last bunch of weeks. Of course, you're sitting in on History 293, Science in a Global Context, a course where I teach some of this material. And so you've had a chance to watch how I try to manage some of these questions. But all I can sort of insist on is that the juiciest way to go after the two cultures debate, it seems to me, is to historicize it. I would think that as a historian, to go back and get how it is that we come to think of there being a divergence between the activity of science on the one hand and the activity of humanistic or literary work on the other. The more extraordinary because, of course, in many respects, philosophy is born as very much the integrity of those two projects. The early philosophical thinkers considered themselves, men of science as much as they were men of the problems of the human condition. And but many people out there listening to this may not be so aware that the term scientist itself doesn't get coined until the early 19th century, which is an indication of just how late this bifurcation, if you want to call it that, really is in our culture.
Yeah, that's mind-boggling. I don't know when I first learned that the word scientist is it's less than 200 years old. It sort of amazes you. And it leads into something I wanted to ask you about, which is, the history of science, I think, powerfully helps us understand what's going on in the evolution battle today or the global warming battle today, because we have many antecedents that are very similar. And maybe we can talk about that. But at the same time, the history of science is not that well understood. I mean, I think that people would be amazed to hear that the word scientist is so young. I think that if you take a major figure like Darwin, and you think, what is the textbook understanding of the history of his idea? It's he went to an island, saw the finches, and had a eureka moment. In fact, a lot of the stories of in history of science are popularly understood as eureka stories, where an apple falls on Newton's head, and boom, suddenly we have a new understanding of the universe. And of course, they're all wrong, right? I mean, that's, but they're wrong in an interesting way, because they oversimplify and they make it seem like it's just progress all the time in knowledge without any detours or delays.
Yeah. I mean, in a funny way, one of the juiciest instances of these kinds of, of the kinds of reciprocal misunderstandings that are possible absent serious engagement with the history of science comes from the debates around the two cultures controversy. So, maybe that's a place to go for a second, and just because it's so deliciously steeped in irony. So, you alluded earlier in our conversation to F.R. Leavis. F.R. Leavis, the distinguished Don, professor of English, critic at Cambridge, roughly Snow's contemporary, who, to a not inconsiderable degree, puts Snow's Two Cultures lecture on the map by attacking it viciously as an exercise in the most depressing Philistinism. So, what does Leavis take from Snow's lecture? Leavis says, so we've got this quote-unquote scientist guy who wanders over to us and says, hey, you literary types, it's pathetic that you guys don't know the second law of thermodynamics. And the reason it's pathetic is that the second law of thermodynamics is of comparable complexity, beauty, and import as any Shakespeare play. And just as you feel like it's an indication of culpable ignorance on the part of scientists, if they let their reading in Shakespeare fall behind, you feel like it's culpable ignorance on the part of literary intellectuals that they've let themselves get so far behind in their study of thermodynamics. Well, says Leavis, let me just tell you a few things. Literature taint about these flat-footed, irrelevant physical principles that govern the mindless world. Literature is the human soul inscribed in tangible form. It is an effort to make sense of the intractable and ineluctable questions of how to live and what to do, and the second law of thermodynamics, baby, just can't touch that. And furthermore, you, Snow, go on to say that, in reality, you feel like the literary intellectuals have allowed their love affair with themselves to collapse into a kind of tragic decadence. You see the late 19th and early 20th century brutalist literature as part of what drew us step by step closer to the monstrosities of the Second World War and the Holocaust. So there's a fair bit of that sort of finger pointing in the Snow piece. So what does Leavis say? He says, first of all, you're a cretin, and anybody who thinks that the brute laws of nature could rise to the spiritual import of a great work of literature is, by definition, a cretin. And he builds, Leavis does, his responsive essay to Snow out of a very, very elegant reading of the kind of existential melodrama of a great, great Joseph Conrad short story novella called The Shadow Line. And in the shadow line, a young sea captain takes command over a ship for the first time in the Pacific. He is becalmed almost immediately. That is to say, there's no wind, so he can't easily command his vessel and the men who are underneath him. And the novella, in which essentially nothing happens, this young man confronts the challenge of leadership and sort of taking command over the ship, both of himself and the ship that is entrusted to him. Okay, so Leavis does this reading of the shadow line. Now here's the great stinking pile of irony that lies at the very center of this exchange. Snow on the one hand, pointing fingers at Leavisites and saying, you guys don't know the second law of thermodynamics, and moreover, decadent literature brought us step by step closer to the collapse of civilization. Leavis looking back at Snow and saying, cretins like you don't understand what makes The Shadow Line the greatest novella of all times, and moreover, as I recall, the Holocaust was, above all, an industrial, technical operation. Those smokestacks look a lot more like the skylines of Manchester and Liverpool than they do like the Lake District. Okay, so what's the irony? The irony is that it turns out that Conrad knew the second law of thermodynamics very, very well indeed, not least because it had been codified within thinking memory of his late 19th century writings. And unbeknownst both to Leavis and to Snow, the discovery of the second law of thermodynamics, namely that disorder is forever on the increase, that usable energy in the universe is always slipping away, and that, by implication, we end in an icy, crystalline universe where there's no usable energy. That second law and its discovery had a cataclysmic effect on literary and artistic intelligence in the second half of the 19th century. It seemed to spell the death of progress, which was the thing that everyone had always thought, justified all the work that had been put in over the course of the 19th century in science and technology, not to mention literature. So it spelled the death knell of progress. It told us we were all going to die in a kind of icy burning out of the sun. It couldn't have been more obscene. And moreover, Conrad, it turns out, effectively drafted the shadow line itself as something like a parable of the second law of thermodynamics. In other words, it's a story about the loss of usable energy.
I had no idea. That's really
It's
funny.
great. It's totally insane. So basically, the kind of decadent, tragic, despairing moves in late 19th and early 20th century literature that Snow identified and that he lamented are in fact, can easily be laid at the feet of the very second law of thermodynamics that he has, put on a pedestal as the kind of, scientific knowledge upon which we must attend. And correspondingly, and how's the irony run the other way? Here you've got F.R. Leavis, pipe clamped between his lips, waving his hand dismissively in his smoky office about how it is that you can't trust a guy like Snow because he can't do an adequate reading of the shadow line. And by the way, who the hell cares about the second law of thermodynamics? When I think the most defensible and indeed engaging reading of the shadow line that you can imagine is one that trades exactly on the author's knowledge of the second law of thermodynamics. So, I offer that as a story about how it is, really only through serious engagement with the history of science that it's possible to understand and to knit the connectedness of domains that, it's easy journalistically to argue have diverged or have nothing to do with each other. And it's easy normatively to say, we think that people who work on agricultural chemistry are good and people who work on, the prosody of the Fairy Queen are wasting collective time and money. But it's really only by taking the historical approach that you can begin to kind of really get your hands around the sophistication of the relationships between science and society over the last 500 years.
No, I hear you. I mean, when you were saying that, I just remember the Tom Stoppard play Arcadia, which draws a lot of literary force out of the second law of thermodynamics, and a lot of big moments in science have major literary repercussions. I mean, a lot of studies have been done of Darwin's impact on literature, as I'm sure you know.
One hardly knows where to begin. I mean, I was just yesterday afternoon at a meeting at the Kitchen here in Manhattan where a bunch of different sorts of folks and artists, intellectuals, we're all getting together to plan the drafting of a big grant for requesting money for a couple of year workshop on the relationship between science and the arts. And, part of what we were noticing as we were doing the background research for this grant is just, what an extraordinarily rich field we have to draw on, whether you want to go back to the 17th century and talk about the development of new optical technologies and their impact on the arts, and the development of new artistic techniques and their impact on optical technologies, or you want to do, 19th century development of the chemical industry and synthetic pigments, or right into the 20th century, where, to be honest with you, there's hardly a serious contemporary artist except, the really arriere-garde reactionaries, who isn't, to a very serious degree, engaged with modern media and technology to a considerable extent. So, another way in which the Snow formulation, it seems to me, really misses the mark is the extent to which, even in his own time, you had folks like the Italian futurists who built a literary, intellectual, artistic movement purely out of their obsession with science and technology. And, it really requires a certain kind of Cambridge complacency in 1959 to offer the kind of diagnosis that he did. And that's why it's essential to emphasize that diagnosis had a great deal to do with, priorities for research bursaries at English universities in that period. It was a contest over resources, how many postgraduate fellowships would be funded in math, physics, chemistry, versus English classics, arts, letters, that kind of thing.
Well, there's another great irony, too, with it, and I want to get back to, other aspects of history of science, too, but there's another great irony with Leavis attacking Snow, because, he does it in this brutally dismissive way, which I don't know if the quotes are fully in my mind, but he says, Snow can't be called a novelist. He wouldn't know what a novel is if one fell on him, or something to that effect. He's totally, ripping him to shreds in this particularly sophisticated way that could even be called, I think, snobbish. But by attacking him in this way, he puffs him up. I mean, this is the public relations rule that a lot of people today who are fighting over politics every day know is, by attacking someone, you're elevating them because you're saying they're worth attacking. And
I mean, Leavis goes through a certain amount of gymnastics on this very question by way of throat clearing. The real question is, should I bother to do this? I ignored him for a couple of years. I think the Leavis essay is 62 or 63, so he tries to ignore it. But he, when he sees it starting to show up on high school reading lists, he blows a gasket and he says, what's pathetic is that I should have to do this. And I confess that even though I don't like Leavis a special lot, and he certainly embodies much of what is worst about a certain kind of English academic culture in the period, it's also worth saying that, he does nail the guy on a number of counts. So I feel like, I won't say that my heart lies with him when I finish reading The Exchange, because in the end, one is inclined to declare a pax on both their houses, and just to remind oneself of how big and how much more complex these questions have become in the period since. And again, that's part of your ambit.
Yeah. Well, let me. I think we've definitely gotten Snow and Leavis pinned down. I think it's a great prelude to the conference at the New York Academies, where we're going to have people like E.O. Wilson talking about the two cultures, Ken Miller, Lawrence Krauss, a lot of other great people sort of giving their takes on this question. But let me do a little more PR for the history of science, right? I mean, it seems like again, my sense of what the popular perception is that one of the stories of the history of science is not just that, knowledge always progresses and, great scientists have their eureka moments, which is cliched and oversimplified and doesn't really tell us that much about how knowledge grows, but also that, knowledge every time it advances, it smites superstition, and basically the story is, science, advancing despite the church trying to pull it back. And the Middle Ages were the time of a flat Earth, which they weren't, right? And, that narrative too. I mean, why are there all these completely wrong narratives about what the history of science is? That's something I don't know. What would your take be on that?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's in another way a hard question to nail down because, the history of what actually happened is hard enough. The history of all the misprisions, misunderstandings, all the wrong-headed stuff that's out there, boy, you really, you start to overload the circuits. But I think one tidy, broad, intellectual history type answer that can be offered to that question goes like this. We can't forget that over the course of the 18th and 19th century, there are a set of major socio-political, economic convulsions that are rocking Europe. They have to do with, notoriously, the rise of the middle class. They have to do with the overthrowing of aristocratic and royalist power. And they have to do with the rise of modern capitalist system and its kind of intensification in the political structures of the emergent nation state. And science gets taken up as a very important cudgel by the forces of reform, who, in a host of different ways, seek to slap down the old aristocracies and, again, famously, the clerics. And so what you watch happen over the 18th and the 19th century is again and again science being taken up as a weapon against the powers of the church and the powers of the Ancien Regime. And I have to feel like that codifies, sets in place a set of moves which become second nature to us as thinkers.
Yeah.
And so the kind of basic move is science slays superstition, because over the course of the 18th century, that's the story that gets told again and again and again by liberal reformers.
Yeah.
And, it is those liberal reformers who in a sense pen what become many of those most durable myths about the relationship between science and religion on the one hand, and, science and superstition come privilege on the other. It's in that process that you see science emerge as an essentially democratic activity, a meritocracy, and it's at the same time you see it emerge as the hammer of spirituality. And, we could go on, here's what I propose, Chris, because I think both of us have stuff we need to turn to pretty soon, and we've clocked pretty close to an hour at this point. Yeah. I propose that, we find ourselves in another conversation before too long about the science and religion question and about its historical roots, because there's just an awful lot to say there. But that would be my answer. The myths come because science does the work of a certain kind of liberal reform across the 18th and 19th centuries in a very serious way, and that sets in place a set of knee-jerk moves that are still with us. They're still in the blogosphere. You watch them happen on a daily, hourly, minutely basis, and they're still with us.
Yeah, no, let's just wrap up on one last point. I'm certainly amazed, from reading some stuff that you've made me read, that a lot of the rhetoric of science versus religion is, already completely there in almost the same form we read it today in the French Revolution.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. It's kind of amazing to see that. But let me just ask, this is one more thing that I constantly have in my mind as I'm thinking about, the history of science on the one hand and the political battles that we're dealing with daily. If, the global warming bill is before the House of Representatives as it is today, or there's an evolution fight in Texas, or, whichever state is after that. The history of science itself gets mobilized as a weapon too, and bad history of science. I'm just thinking of one example. You've got a columnist like George Will of the Washington Post, who I've tangled with, saying, rewriting the history of global warming science in a very simplistic way, and saying, first they were worried about cooling, now they're worried about warming. We can't trust scientists at all.
Sure.
And that's, a misreading of the history of science. You got the history of climate science, and there's, good books on this that sort of set it all straight. Or you got someone like Ben Stein in this movie Expelled saying, basically trying to blame Charles Darwin for Auschwitz. And just making this incredible leap across an incredibly, not only large period of time, but many, many complex issues. Can we use good history of science in these, to rebut this kind of political stuff that we're hearing all the time? Or do historians of science want to stay away from the kind of polemical battles that are going back and forth?
Well, there are just different kinds of historians, just like there are different kinds of scientists. In many ways, the two-culture dichotomy that I think is significant is the distinction between the life of action and the life of contemplation. And that's a division that you can mark out on the terrain of modern intellectual life that cuts totally across sciences, humanities, social sciences, right? You've got people in the humanities who are oriented toward a life of contemplation and disinterested production of knowledge and the teaching thereof. And you have people in the sciences who are interested basically in basic fundamental research, the production of knowledge, the contemplation thereof. And then in both those domains, you similarly have people who think that their role and or the function of their discipline is to change the world. And, that's the two cultures that matters. Sure, there are historians of science who are rolling up their sleeves and are actively involved in science and policy debates right now, just like there are scientists.
And Naomi Oreskes does the refutation of the anti-global warming thing from a
for sure
perspective.
A dear and esteemed colleague. And then on the other hand, you have people who basically like to be in the archives, like to read the sources, like to try to synthesize those sources into readable narratives, and like to teach their classes. Just like you have some atmospheric chemists who basically like spending their time in the lab, and for whom it's anathema to suddenly find themselves with a mic pressed into their nose and to be asked to, say something about the Obama administration. So you want a two cultures division that I think is, really got some legs. It would be that between the active and contemplative life, and it's one that, as I say, trashes the division between the sciences and the culture.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, maybe we can end on that note. But this has been fun. This has been it's been great to go over all this stuff with you. And I'll see you in class. I'll see you at the conference.
Terrific. Good to chat with you, Chris. Take it easy.
Okay. Bye.